The Aebutia clan. This family was of Roman origin and was much more prominent in the early Republic than they were during the decline of the Republic and into the Empire. They were a patrician family, though they did have some plebeian branches that existed. In all, they held 11 magistries during the Republic and 3 consulships, as well as having 1 consulship during the Empire. The first member of the family to reach the consulship was Titus Abusius Helva in the year 499 BC. Titus was also the Magister Equitum, the master of horse under the Roman dictator Aulus Postumius Albus during the Battle of Lake Regillus. It's said that during the battle, Octavius Mamilius, the leader of Tusculum, and Titus charged at each other on horseback, each delivering savage blows to the other. Mamilius, he was struck in the chest and had to be removed from the battlefield, while Titus, he did take a blow from Mamilius's lance that destroyed his arm to the point that it was useless, and he also had to fall back and command his men from the rear. But the Romans were eventually able to pull out the victory, one of most important victories in early Roman history. Another member of this family, Publius Abusius, was actually the man who broke the Bacchanalia scandal in Rome when he told the consuls of the existence of these festivals held in honor of the god Bacchus, where the women and young men of Rome, some from the most distinguished families, would hold secret parties and do immoral things at nighttime. You know what I mean. Livy writes that at these get-togethers, apparently, usually the women outnumbered the men by 2 or 3, and he really didn't like that. He thought that that was a bad thing. What a nerd.
Nerd!
Sadly, like many Roman families, it's not known exactly what happened to the Aebutia. Most likely, they became poor and forgotten, and the name was lost, or they moved away from their homeland to somewhere else during the long fall of the empire, and, the names changed over time. Now, moving on to the next Roman clan. This is probably a family that not many people have heard of. The Ogulnia family. The origin of this family isn't known, most likely because they were just a plebeian family who became prominent during the Middle to Late Republic, and then they really fell off during the later Republic and into the Empire. In total, they had 5 magistries during the Republic, with a one-time consul and 2 plebeian tribunes. They didn't hold any positions during the Empire, but the family, they were still around, as their name has been found on many inscriptions and also some statues that they had built for themselves. Now, this family doesn't have many big names in it, but there were 2 brothers, Quintus Ogulnius and Gnaeus Ogulnius, who, in the year 300 BC, while being tribunes of the plebs, introduced the Ogulnia law, which, for the first time in Rome's history, opened up the various priesthoods and other different religious positions of Rome to the plebeian population, which was a huge step forward in the generational-long battle between the plebeians and patricians in Rome. Quintus will actually end up being consul in the year 269 BC, where he became the man to introduce silver coins into the Roman economy, as well as being a part of the first official meeting between the Romans and the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt, when he traveled alongside some other men to meet the king, who was the son of Alexander the Great's general Ptolemy, the man who began the dynasty. So, for a while, this family was doing quite well for themselves. It's actually said that King Ptolemy gave all the ambassadors of Rome super expensive gifts, so we can only imagine what Quintus returned home with from Egypt. But by the year 182 BC, the family had gained its last position in the Roman government when Marcus Ogulnius Gallus was named Praetor Urbanus. Now, going through the list of known Ogulnia, it's not hard to see why the family fell into obscurity. Died at 16, died at 15, died at 10, died during childhood, was how many of the young Ogulnia men's stories ended, and I assume eventually there was just no more men to carry on the name, and the family ceased to exist. Moving on to the next family, these guys were pretty important in the history of Rome, and for a long time, too. They held some of the most important positions in Rome for almost 500 years, and that doesn't include a single emperor. During the Republic, they held 62 magistries, 36 consulships, 3 censors, 4 plebeian tribunes, and then another 6 more consulships during the empire as well. I'm talking about the Manlia family. Now, not only was this family patrician, but they were one of the oldest patrician families in Rome. Believed to have their origins in the ancient city of Tusculum, after coming to Rome, this family quickly became prominent amongst the other wealthy families there, living there, and it didn't take them long to have one of their members reach the consulship. Gnaeus Manlius Cincinnatus was the first member of this family to reach the consulship in the year 480 BC, just 29 years after the founding of the Republic. Sadly for him, though, he died in battle against the Etruscans in that very same year, though the Romans, they did win the battle that day. Now, I can't go through all of the prominent members of this family. That could be a video all by itself, but let's look at some of the standouts through their 500-year history alongside Rome. Aulus Manlius Vulso, who was the son of Gnaeus Manlius, was a part of the first group of decemvirs. This group, they were tasked with going to Athens and other cities in Greece to study the laws they used there, and then to come back to Rome and create the first set of written laws in Roman history. So, from the year 454 BC to the year of 452 BC, he spent his time in Greece, learning the laws and history of lawmaking, until he and the group returned to Rome and came up with what we know as the 12 Tables. I'm sure many of you have heard of the story about the one time where some geese saved the city of Rome by waking somebody up with the racket they were making, which in turn allowed that person to notice that some Gallic warriors were trying to scale the side of the Capitoline Hill and get to the Romans who were holding out on top of it. Well, it was actually a member of the Manlia family that was awoken and saved the future of Rome that night. Marcus Manlius Capitolinus. He got the name Capitolinus due to his actions that night, but that's not really why I like Marcus. I like Marcus because he was the first member of a patrician family in the history of Rome to advocate for the poorer plebeian class. You see, after Rome was sacked by the Gauls, the plebeian class was in a very, very bad spot. They had to rebuild their entire lives, but with no funds to do so, they had to take loans from the wealthy patrician families, who had managed to save their fortunes during the sack of Rome, or they still had farmland and estates outside of the area that had been untouched by the Gauls. Well, one day, Marcus saw a former centurion being led to the prisons for his unpaid debts, so he rushed over and paid all the man's debts right there on the spot to free him. And he also ended up selling one of his estates to help pay for the debt of some other plebeians who were in trouble as well. But Marcus went a little too far one day, and he accused the Senate, and well, basically all the other patricians and rich men of Rome, that they were embezzling public funds, which they definitely were. And well, they didn't like that very much, so they accused Marcus of trying to become a king, and they sentenced him to death. But the comitia that was assembled to vote on Marcus's fate, Well, they wouldn't do it in view of the Capitoline Hill where Marcus had saved Rome. So they left the city, went outside of the walls to a place where the Capitoline wasn't in view anymore, and voted for him to be thrown from the Tarpeian Rock. One day, you are the hero of Rome, and the next day, you find yourself hurtling towards Rome's streets, thrown from a cliff, by the very same people you saved. Hey there, guys, just a quick little interruption. Sorry, I just want to let y'all know that I do have a podcast for all of my historical videos. You can find them on pretty much any of the podcast apps. Pretty sure they're on all of them, but yeah, if you want to check it out, go check it out. If not, oh well, back to the video. The next member of this family that needs a mention is Titus Manlius Imperiosus Torquatus. A 3-time consul and 3-time dictator, he was one of the heroes of the early republic, and seen as one of the greatest Romans to ever live by the generations that followed him. So much so that one of his descendants will try to emulate him in every aspect of his life, even if it means killing one of his own sons. Now, as a young man, Titus was actually banished from the city of Rome by his father, apparently due to the fact that Titus had a speech impediment. But even though his dad was kind of a dick for doing that, when he was going to be put on trial, Titus was recalled to Rome by the tribune who was going to be leading the trial against his dad. He showed up at the tribune's house, Marcus Pomponius, the tribune. He expected that Titus would assist in the trial and condemn his father for the way, that he treated him in banishing him from Rome. But instead, Titus waited till the two were alone and then pulled out a knife, which he then used to threaten the tribune to drop the charges against his father, or else he would end his life right then and there. And, well, it worked. Pomponius, he made a public oath to drop the charges against Titus's father and to never again bring them up. It was only 2 years later, in the year 361 BC, that Titus found himself in the army of the dictator Titus Quinctus Pennus, and across the river Ainio, from some Gauls who were looking for a fight. When a man from the Gallic side of the river stepped onto the bridge, challenging the Romans, any of them, to single combat. Nobody, though, took the challenge. Apparently this guy was a very, very large man and was quite intimidating. But not to Titus. He went to the dictator and volunteered to go fight the giant of a man 1v1. As the fight began, Titus, who apparently had less armor than the Gaul, used his speed and agility to either block or parry away the attacks of the warrior that was trying to kill him, until eventually he saw an opening, slipped inside the range of the Gaul's sword, and drove his own sword up into the groin and stomach of his enemy, ending not only the fight, but also sending the rest of the Gallic army running. This is where he gets the name Torquatus from, as after he killed the Gallic warrior, he took the torque from around his neck and made it his own. A torque was pretty much just a stiff necklace that many Gallic people wore. Moving forward about 20 years now, through that time Titus was elected to consulships and dictators multiple times, but moving forward to the year 340 BC, when Titus was again elected as one of the 2 consuls of the year. During this time, the Romans were having issues with the Latin League, and were at war with them, even though they were the head of the Latin League, so it was kind of like a civil war, but not really, more like a rebellion. I mean, it gets messy and people switch sides all the time, so... Anyways, Titus, still the same guy. Well, he decided that while he was in charge of the army, he was going to instill some discipline in the soldiers and bring back the harsher punishments from back in his time as a soldier, where any man caught leaving their post was put to death. Well, that backfired on him because one day, while being a lookout at a Roman post, Titus's son and a few of his friends saw some scouts riding nearby from the army of the Latin League. Disobeying the orders to stay at their post and not to leave until told to do so, the young men, well, they rode out after the scouts. And they did end up beating them in a little bit of a battle, more like a skirmish. But they won, and they took their spoils of victory back to Titus to show him. But the loot and the victory meant nothing to Titus. He was furious with his son for disobeying orders and publicly shamed him for doing so. He then had his own son executed in front of all the men to show how serious he was about following the rules. Now, let's move on to a man named Lucius Manlius Vulso Longus, a two-time consul, once in 256 BC and also during 250 BC. Now, if you know about the Punic Wars, especially the first one, you'll know this guy was one of the two consuls that led the Roman fleet at the Battle of Cape Ecnomus, which was one of the biggest naval battles in all of history. This battle was, of course, fought between the Romans and the Carthaginians. The Romans, led by the two consuls Lucius Manlius and Marcus Atilius Regidus, and the Carthaginians, led by a general named Hamilcar and also Hanno the Great. Hanno was actually part of the faction in Carthage that didn't even want to go to war with Rome, and he would rather spend his time conquering Africa, where his interests were. He is actually given a lot of blame for the reason why Hannibal never got sent reinforcements after his victory at Cannae. He didn't like the Barcid family, so he did everything he could to convince the Carthaginian Senate to not send any more men or supplies to Hannibal. Anyways, during the Battle of Cape Ecnomus, both consuls, Lucius and Marcius, were in the thick of the fighting. Leading the way on their ships, the consuls saw an opening to attack when the flanks of the Carthaginian lines. They sailed a little bit too far forward and exposed the middle of the line. Lucius and Marcus, they sailed their ships directly into the center and began a long, hard battle. Eventually, though, the Romans were able to kill or capture enough of the Carthaginian sailors that the rest of them broke. But the battle wasn't done yet. The left flank of the Carthaginian ships, well, they had sailed by in the beginning of the battle to go and attack the transport ships that were in the back of the Roman lines. And now these ships, they held all the supplies and all the horses that the Romans would need if they were going to make landfall in Africa and conduct a campaign there. So they really couldn't afford to lose those ships. Lucius directed his men to sail right for the remaining Carthaginian ships. Well, Marcus, he took his ships and headed for Hanno, who was on the other flank making an escape, freaking running away. But after finishing off the last of the Carthaginian ships left in the battle, the Romans had either sunk or captured about half of the Carthaginian fleet. After making landfall in Africa and doing a little raiding and sieging, Lucius Manlius, he took the Roman fleet and the prisoners all the way back to Rome, and was highly regarded for his actions in saving the transport ships, which really did allow the Romans to continue the war expedition into Africa that year. I mean, if they had lost those ships, great job winning the Battle of Cape Ecnomus, but if you lose the transport ships, they would have just had to turn around and go home, really. He was a huge key factor in Roman recruiting, not of soldiers, but of sailors, and was instrumental in building Rome's first navies during the First Punic War. Lucius Manlius Vulso lived until the old age of 83, which back then was super old. I mean, it's pretty old now even, let's be honest, but not many people ever got to that age, so good for him. Moving on to another member of the family, it's another Titus Manlius. The Romans, well, they loved reusing names. This Titus, though, was first elected consul in the year 235 BC, alongside a man named Gaius Atilius Bulbus. Titus was sent to the island of Sardinia to pacify the island after it had come under Roman control after the First Punic War. After putting down some rebels and achieving his goal, it's said that Titus then returned to Rome for a triumph, and then after that closed the gates to the Temple of Janus, which stayed closed for 8 years apparently. I don't see how that could be though, because the Romans were always at war with somebody, but oh well, we'll let them have it. But yeah, this guy was the last guy to close the gates of the temple all the way up until Augustus closed them for good once he had solidified his hold on Rome after his final victory over Mark Antony at the Battle of Actium. During his second consulship in the year 224 BC, so 11 years later, Titus and his consular colleague Fulvius Flaccus, well, they marched into the lands of the Boii tribe. They were the first consuls to ever lead a Roman army over the Po River, and in doing so, they managed to defeat the Boii in a battle where the Romans were able to kill around 20,000 of them. But due to disease and not having enough supplies, the Romans were forced to retreat back over the river. His most important victory, though, came during the Second Punic War, after the Battle of Cannae, where the Romans were absolutely crushed by Hannibal. Titus, at this time, was considered an old man, and he actually opposed anybody paying any type of ransom to free the prisoners of the battle, because in his mind, they didn't do enough or try hard enough to break through Hannibal's forces and flee to safety, so, screw them. It was in the year 215 BC, as a praetor, that Titus was again sent to the island of Sardinia to take over for the Roman governor there who had fallen ill. During this time, the Carthaginians and some Sardinian rebels, they thought it would be a good idea to try and take the island back from Rome. Titus met Hasdrubal the Bald during the fall of 215 near the town of Corrales to face off in battle. According to the records, it was a classic ancient battle with, both sides setting up with their infantry in the center and cavalry on the wings. They then marched forward and engaged in a long back and forth fight that ended up going for most of the day and even into the evening. The battle, though, was decided when finally a Roman contingent of cavalry was able to force their foes off the battlefield, and smartly, instead of chasing them, they turned around and charged right into the flanks of the Carthaginians and Sardinian rebels, who broke very quickly after that and fled the field. This victory, it pretty much put Sardinia firmly in the hands of Rome, and it also gave a much-needed boost to the grain production that was severely lacking back in Italy due to Hannibal's destruction of so much Roman farmland. So the victory here in Sardinia was key to the overall winning of the war. At one point, in his old age, Titus became the oldest living senator in the year 210 BC, which would put him in his 70s or 80s when he was elected dictator in the year 208 BC. But, like everyone, Titus did eventually pass away peacefully in the year 202. The next member of the family we'll talk about is actually the grandson of the previous one, and, well, his name was also Titus. He had a decent political career, becoming consul once in the year 165 BC, but really, his most famous act, I guess you could say, was when he held his own son on trial. It was in the year 140 BC when one of his sons, Decimus Junius Silanus Manlianus, was accused by envoys from Macedonia, where he was praetor, of corruption. Titus asked the Senate if he himself could hold a private trial of his son in his own home, where he himself would be prosecuting his son. And if you remember from earlier how an ancestor of Titus had his own son killed, well, after a 3-day trial, Titus found his own son guilty of the charges laid against him and banished him from his sight and from Rome. Now, he didn't order his son to be killed, but the shame and the apparent code of honor in the Manlia family caused so much turmoil within Decimus that he hung himself the very next night. And apparently, Titus, he didn't even look at the funeral procession as it went by his home, let alone actually attend the funeral of his own son. This Titus would also make it into old age and pass away peacefully there. Well, as peacefully as a man can after basically killing one of his kids. And maybe the Roman people had had enough of this family, because after this, Titus and his brother gained the consulship one time each. It wouldn't be for another 100 years that another one of the Manlia family were able to reach those heights again. And it wasn't really the same for Lucius Manlius as it had been for his illustrious ancestors. He wasn't elected consul by his peers or in a normal way, let's say. Initially, during the year of 66 BC, Lucius lost his bid at the consulship to Publius Atronius Paetus and Publius Cornelius Sulla, the latter being the nephew of the infamous Lucius Cornelius Sulla. But Lucius and another man by the name of Lucius Aurelius Cotta, well, they claimed that the other two men had used bribery to win the election, and the two consuls were actually condemned. So in their place, for the two, now open positions really, Lucius and Cotta were given the consulships. This apparently led to the first Catilinarian conspiracy, but most historians agree that this first conspiracy most likely never happened, and it was all made up by Cicero, and I tend to agree because, how is he going to conspire to murder the consuls? And they all know about it, but then they just, let him go until he goes and then tries it again after or later? Yeah, that doesn't make sense. Lucius did, though, play a big part in stopping the actual Catilinarian conspiracy when it did occur in the year 63 BC, as well as also playing a role in the civil war between Caesar and Pompey. Though not a very good role. Sadly for Titus, he chose the wrong side and fought with Pompey against Caesar. Pompey put him in charge of the defense of Oricum, but when Caesar showed up there, he kind of just gave up and surrendered the city, and Caesar, well, he of course pardoned him. After being pardoned by Caesar, though, Titus made his way back to Pompey, and we next see him at the Battle of Dyrrachium, where he led a portion of Pompey's army on an attack against Caesar's fortifications, which ended up being successful and forcing Caesar to retreat. We next see Titus in the Pompeian army at the Battle of Thapsus, where this time Caesar won a decisive victory, forcing Titus, alongside many, many others, to try and escape. But the ships they were all on were eventually found trying to enter into a port at the city of Hippo Regius. Outnumbered by Caesarian forces, Titus and the rest of the Pompeian forces were easily defeated, and like many other senators that day, Titus was either executed upon his capture or he committed suicide. The last of the Manlia family I'd like to mention is a woman. Now, sadly for us, we do have many names of the females of this family, but none of their life stories. Because, well, let's be real here, the Romans didn't write biographies about women, but we can't pretend like women didn't play a huge role in all of Roman history as well. Manlia Scantilia actually ended up becoming Empress of Rome in the year 193 AD, though it was just for 3 short months because, unluckily for her, her husband was Didius Julianus, who ascended to the emperorship during the year of 5 emperors, and it didn't take very long for him to be killed by a soldier inside the royal palace. She did survive the regime change, though, but died shortly after, about a month after her husband's funeral, so maybe she didn't, really. Also, sadly, nothing is known about the daughter, that she bore Didius. She disappears into history, like so many others. And that is the Manlia gens. Not all of its members throughout history, but some of the more prominent members of the family. As you can see, this family was very strict about discipline. From one father executing his son for disobeying orders, another father basically shaming his son into suicide, and the Manlia family members denying people during the Second Punic War from paying ransom to Hannibal so that they could get their sons back. This family was all about tradition and upholding what they believed to be Roman values and discipline. You could say they would probably be a conservative type family in today's age, looking to the past glory days and trying to emulate what their ancestors had done before them, as well as trying to shape Roman society into the type of society they believed it should be. This family was all over Roman history, pretty much in all the major events from the creation of the 12 tables, all the generations of battles and diplomacy with other peoples and within themselves as Rome grew, the Punic Wars, the civil wars of Marius and Sulla, through the times of Caesar and Augustus, and even at one point, having an empress amongst their ranks. They had a pretty damn amazing run over the course of around 500 years, but like all good things, the Manlia came to an end. There was some people during the 5th century AD that claimed to be descendants of the Manlia family, but nobody ever had any real proof to link themselves back to the family, so most likely this family was around to the fall of the West, and like many other wealthy aristocratic families, moved away from Rome and either became poor or married off into other families and, left the name behind. Learning about this family, it really put into perspective why Rome lasted for so long. Even when multiple times it looked like they were beaten or about to surrender, they never did because of families like this one. When you have families that are a part of the ruling class like the Manlia, I guess you can say their morals or outlook on society and life and how it should be lived, bleeds into the population that are under them. And it's not just the Manlia family. Yes, they were very serious about discipline and following the rules set by the generations that came before them, but many other of the leading families were as well. When you have multiple leading families all trying to uphold the glory and illustriousness of their ancestors who did great things for Rome, it's very easy to see how Rome and Roman society was so hard to stamp out. When the leaders of a society, the ruling class, live by a strong set of morals and ethics and are all pretty much on the same page of how a society should be run, that culture, I guess you could say, that they manifest at the top bleeds down into the society that they're on top of. And it creates strong bonds of community, religion, politics, etc. throughout the entire society. Now, whether that culture is good for the world or not is up to debate. I can guarantee you all the people that the Romans enslaved were not too happy about how awesome and cool the Romans thought their society was, and how difficult it would be to try and get all these people to give up on the idea of Rome. When you have a ruling class that isn't just there to collect wealth off of the people they rule over and live lavish lives of luxury off of the backs of their population, but in this case also somewhat respectable with how they deal with things like honor and loyalty and discipline, as well as not being hypocritical in the things they preach, like fighting bravely and following through with punishments, even if it's against one of their own. It goes a long way in how the average person in that society's population is going to see life and what is expected from them and, what they believe and how they think. I mean, geez, look at our ruling class today. It's full of a bunch of incompetent, idiotic, selfish, corrupt, sleazy pedos that are all playing the system they control to make themselves more wealthy, while the people they are supposed to be governing are seeing worse and worse qualities of life with every generation. Now, don't get me wrong. Don't get me wrong here at all. I'm not out here saying that the Roman ruling class didn't have a bunch of, you know, shitty people in it too. But at least they had some people to look at and admire and emulate in good ways. Of course, they had their problems, their corruption. Obviously, it was a slave society, so I'm not telling everybody, let's go back to that. No. But I guess I'm just trying to make the point of, at least maybe for the first couple 100 years, even though they were still typical greedy ruling class people, they had some other characteristics that would be good for a society to emulate and follow. Unlike nowadays, when we have basically zero leaders to look at, or that you could even fathom actually give a crap about any of the people that they're supposed to be ruling over. Anyways, that's it for this one. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you're still here, thanks for listening. And I hope you have a good one.